And move forward with roll call.
Okay, Ms. Friedman,
Here.
Mr. Arnold,
Here.
Ms. Banks, Ms. Bell, Mr. Brown,
Present.
Ms. Carter,
Here.
Mr. Janai,
Here.
Reverend Gordon, Ms. Harding,
Here.
Ms. Mendoza-Lot,
Here.
Mr. Knowles, Mr. O'Connor, Ms. Rodriguez,
Here.
Dr. Russell,
Here.
Mr. Stengel,
Here.
Major White.
Thank you. Okay, let's recognize our visitors. We'll start with you, Richard.
Michael Carter.
Lynette Hare. Pam Heinstein.
Robert Kasperzak, board staff.
Latrice Flowers.
Tina Lacy, board staff.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Well, let's take a quick moment, since Ms. Flowers failed to recognize herself as a board staff member, to recognize Latrice Flowers. She started on Monday, so yesterday.
Welcome.
She's our new manager of training and development.
Welcome.
And we are so thankful to have her.
Wonderful. Determination of items to be removed from the consent agenda. The meeting notes from November 15, treasurer's report, planning and oversight committee charter approval, TBD Solutions consultant agreement renewal approval, NAMI Danny's Place funding agreement, labor, project labor agreement policy approval, and health officer designation, and executive and nominating committee charter approval. And just for your note, 7B is being pulled from the consent agenda.
Say again.
7B is being pulled from the consent agenda. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Roll call.
Mr. Arnold,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Ms. Carter,
Yes.
Mr. Janai,
Yes.
Ms. Harding,
Yes.
Ms. Mendoza-Lot,
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez,
Yes.
Dr. Russell,
Yes.
Mr. Stengel,
Yes.
Major White.
Yes.
Thank you. And Scott?
Okay, so let me draw your attention to page 18, middle of the page, policy revision approval, non-healthcare related benefits. This policy was approved, presented, and at the executive and nominating committee meeting, and there was a lot of discussion about what was actually presented, and there was some requested changes. The motion was approved to add 2 additional personal days to align ourselves with what Lucas County's, the number of holidays that Lucas County had received. And I'm paraphrasing a bit, but I think I'm kind of getting mixed up, so I'm gonna stop and reset. The county had recently approved 2 additional holidays for non-bargaining unit employees. When I received notification of that, I compared it against our holiday policy and found that we only had 12 holidays. Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve were the difference between what we had and the other county employee non-bargaining unit. At the Executive and Nominating Committee, I presented a plan to add 2 additional floating holidays to the board non-benefit, non-healthcare related benefits package to account for that discrepancy, but encourage the utilization of those floating holidays for other cultural type holidays and observances. Through our discussion at the Executive and Nominating Committee, it was suggested that instead of creating a new category of floating holiday, that we just add 2 personal days. That is reflected in the current policy that you have in front of you. However, as we began to discuss internally operationalizing that policy for this year, it became apparent that the current policy would not align itself well for that strategy, because the current policy dictates personal days on a pro rata basis based on your start date, based on part-time, full-time. And it was my belief that it was not the intent of the Executive and Nominating Committee to allocate those days this year like that. So I added an additional motion that appears on the top of page 19 from that which was approved by the Executive and Nominating Committee. So the Executive and Nominating Committee actually approved the first motion. They did not see the second motion, which is why it was pulled from the consent agenda. And essentially what the second motion does is approves for calendar year 22, which is today through the end of December 31st, an additional 16 hours of personal time for full-time employees, and an additional 8 hours for part-time employees, effective immediately. So between now and then, everybody will have an additional 2 days off this calendar year, which essentially aligns with what the non-bargaining unit county employees had received. And then for next year, our policy as presented is straightforward and will work with the intended purposes. You can see that I actually added language in section 5 of the policy on page 21 to account for that, and then added language, staff are encouraged to utilize personal leave to celebrate cultural holidays and observances not identified in section 1A of this policy. So what we had hoped is that if there are days such as Hanukkah, or the celebration of Kwanzaa, or their birthday, or whichever holiday or observance they might want to do, because it's special to them or special to their family or their culture, that they would have the freedom to do that. And so I'm going to stop there and be happy to answer any questions, but you do have motions on the top of page 29.
Maybe 19.
That too.
It's 19. It's
Just keeping you on your toes.
He's making sure I pay attention.
After that, it was hard to follow, so I thought you might have lost it.
I certainly support keeping this without regulation. I do wonder, given the move to make the holiday structure more inclusive of people who don't belong to the Judeo-Christian tradition, would it make more sense to remove Christmas Day and put New Year's Eve on the days of official holidays, so that there's no, because it's the only religious holiday that's listed. And so it still keeps that as central. So
Well, my initial response would just thinking a little bit about is, I don't think we're trying to take anything away
Yeah.
or highlight any one religion or culture over another, but traditionally Christmas Day has been observed by, by government entities such as ours. Removing it and adding New Year's Eve to that would essentially mean that people would have to take their personal day on Christmas Day, right? I mean, that's kind of what you're insinuating.
Yeah. It doesn't actually change anything other than the optic.
It does change the optic, and I'd be interested to hear what the other trustees have to say about it.
Doesn't it change not only does it change the optic, but it changes the day, the holiday.
Yeah.
For those people who, we traditionally, places are closed on Christmas.
Like the entire
So-
building's closed.
Right, yeah,
And our
so,
employees here have the option to work from home, isn't that right? So if somebody was Muslim or Jewish, and they chose, they wanted to work that day, so they could get another day.
well, yeah, they could,
They can still do
could
that.
still do that.
Well, they are given this day
Right,
off.
so that's like a free day. That's not one of the personal days. And so then everybody would have to take Christmas as a person. I don't know.
I mean, if it's gonna be
I think
a
it
hassle,
changes.
I celebrate Christmas, so it doesn't really matter to me.
But,
Based
no,
on the
but I
description
hear
for the
you.
policy, based on the description for the reason for this, for doing it this way, rather than adding the holidays that the county has had, it's just a thought that came to mind.
Well, I think policy-wise, if you're gonna go with the county, you need to stick with what they have. If this is how it is written, then that's what we were trying to do, is to stay with the county policy.
To align as close as possible. I
Right.
think,
Right.
I think the conversation is appropriate because we want to be intentional about how we consider ethnic and cultural equity, right? So we understand also that there are traditions built into the county government and to our system that just make our organization more efficient and effective. And observing the holidays that are traditionally observed, I believe does that because we shut down when everybody else shuts down. And yes, people can work from home, but there are certain people who are more effective when everybody else is open. Because there's more interaction, there's more. So, my feeling is that it will become a thing if we take that off. That doesn't mean we should or shouldn't do it, it just means it will be.
It would be challenging.
I think,
Well-
I don't even know how we would code it in PeopleSoft or anything like that.
Well, I think
Yeah.
there'll be a whole other
Yeah.
group of people
Yeah.
that would probably take offense to that they would have to take a day off for a holiday that they find to be very sacred.
And it's mixing
But
apples
like-
and oranges. It's mixing
Right, I mean, I
holidays
think
and
that-
personal days, which are two different categories. Because Christmas is under a holiday, and we're really only trying to impact personal days.
Yes, but the personal days were impacted because the county added two specific holidays, Christmas Eve and Christmas and New Year's. And we're saying we're not gonna use those two, we're gonna take the hours and put them under personal days. So I do recognize what you're saying, I recognize what you're saying, I would certainly
Wait, so I
be.
think I'm not interpreting it correctly. I thought, I was seeing that we're aligning with the county, and
With
then
the-
we're additionally adding 2 days that can be used. Okay. and
We're
that's
just
fine. So
not
I
adding the days.
disregard everything I
So
said.
rather
I'm
than
backing up.
aligning with the county,
Exactly.
adding to our.
So this would not, all it would do would be an optic thing, it wouldn't actually, I mean, I don't know how it works.
In addition to, see, I thought it was in addition.
I'd be reluctant to say that, yeah, that's something we should do without talking to my fiscal people on how all of that could be worked out in our accounting system.
The other thing is, the thing that I've heard this year, with Thanksgiving Day, that's a day celebrating the annihilation of the American Indian. So, I mean, we can get into a whole, yeah. We don't wanna get into that. And that impacts 2 days, Thanksgiving and the Friday after.
And I certainly don't want to pull this issue up and then deny board staff 2 extra days, because we're not gonna meet again before this. So, I voiced it.
Yeah, I think
You-
it's a good point.
It is, it's not that it's not a valid point,
Yeah,
it is, it is.
absolutely.
It's just the system, because it's been systemic for years, we can't dismantle everything all at once. I think we have to do it step by step, and this is a step, I believe, in the right direction by allowing staff to pick, do you want to celebrate Christmas Eve or not? Do you know, what are your family traditions, you know? Would you rather use those, that Christmas Eve and that New Year's Eve in a different way, that fits more your culture, your lifestyle? It's a huge step in the right direction, and I'm very proud of us for taking this step in that direction. And moving forward, as we can take a look at the other holidays and start doing the same thing. But at this given point in time, I think this is the right step at the right time in the right direction. But, so, no, don't think it's not. Okay, do I have a motion?
Yeah, you have a motion.
Second.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Mr. Arnold,
Yes.
Ms. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Ms. Carter,
Yes.
Mr. Janai,
Yes.
Ms. Harding,
Yes.
Ms. Mendoza Lot,
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez,
Yes.
Dr. Russell,
Yes.
Mr. Stengel,
Yes.
Major White.
Yes.
Thank you. Moving right along to Scott's lengthy director's report.
Before you do that, can we clarify what it was we voted on, the prior vote? Were we voting to adopt the consent agenda?
Yes,
Okay, have we approved the minutes from the last meeting?
yes, that was part of the consent agenda.
I didn't think it was.
No.
Yeah, I read it off.
Let's just go back and.
Yeah, we can go back and approve just the minutes. I did read that off as part of the
It was,
consent.
I have a circle list.
Yeah, I had the, Seth and I talked about that, I erred in not putting the circle
Oh,
in there.
okay, I didn't think it was part of the consent agenda.
Well, we can go back.
We can go back and
do
do
it.
it, yeah, it's no harm.
Okay. Do we have any changes for the meeting notes from the last meeting? On November 15th? Okay, do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Thank you, everybody. I think everybody said first.
You threw Susie off, though.
And then roll call on the, this is for the meeting notes.
Ready? Mr. Arnold,
Abstain.
Ms. Bell,
Yes.
Mr. Brown,
Yes.
Ms. Carter,
Yes.
Mr. Janai,
Yes.
Ms. Harding,
Yes.
Ms. Mendoza Lot,
Yes.
Ms. Rodriguez,
Yes.
Dr. Russell,
Yes.
Mr. Stengel,
Yes.
Major White.
Yes.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you, David, for bringing it to our attention and to, but now, Scott, are you ready for your lengthy?
I am, and it is rather lengthy, I do apologize up front. But I think it's appropriate time on behalf of staff to thank you for the 2 additional holiday, personal days. They will be used wisely, I'm sure, and they are very much appreciated. So thanks. So, we're going to be all over the place today. So let's start with, as you know, our General Assembly wrapped up its activity for the year. last Wednesday night, I believe, or actually Thursday night, something like that, about 6 a.m. in the morning, so I guess it's morning. But something came out of it that we want to take note of. In the wee hours of the morning, they passed House Bill 45. Now, of course, the governor has to sign everything by the end of the year. Or he has to veto it, one or the other, but we don't think this is going to be vetoed. There are two things that are relevant to us. The first is House Bill 45 provided $85 million to Ohio Moss to collaborate with the Department of Higher Education to build behavioral health discipline programs for colleges and universities, think workforce, and to lead other recruitment, training, and retention initiatives for the behavioral health workforce. So we've had a lot of conversation about workforce within our strategic planning. We heard it in our stakeholder forums very clearly. We had some conversations even in our recent meetings about some of the things we might be able to do to help develop workforce for the system. This money may be available to help fund those types of activities, among other things. The second thing is as exciting. It's $90 million in Ohio Moss to build and improve crisis infrastructure, capital expenses in particular, but also has some operations, things like that. Why is that important? Because in my conversations with the director of Ohio Moss, these are the funds that she has been targeting to help us fund Danny's Place. So now that clears the way for a larger ask for Danny's Place, that brings us one step closer to the reality of putting shovels in the ground. So it's very exciting and very good news. Other good news, staffing updates. You've met our two staff. I didn't mean to not introduce or reintroduce Miss Bettina. She goes as Tina Layson.
Hello, everyone.
Tina started last week and was introduced to our Executive and Nominating Committee. She is our manager of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging. And of course, I've already introduced Latrice. We are also expecting our accounting specialist to start on January 9th. So if you're keeping track, we have filled 4 of the vacant positions since August. Our manager of communications position that is going from part-time to full-time, we're still working out the specific date, but it will be sometime in late January or early February. So we're very excited to see that, and of course that will help open the gateway for many of the items that we were discussing in our strategic planning about communication. That is correct, yes. So we still have 4 vacant positions. My executive assistant, which is very evident in the way I'm doing some of these things, right? The senior manager of programs and services position, the grants manager position, and the technology systems analyst position. Each one of the departments, with the exception of Michael, who was very efficient at filling his positions, each has an opening in their departments now. We will begin, they're currently open, they're on the county website, but we're not getting a lot of traffic now. And normally you don't see a lot of traffic during the holidays. But we will reinvigorate our search process beginning in the new year and think a little differently about strategy and how we recruit or attempt to recruit folks. So just wanted to just give you that staff update. We're very pleased that we were able to fill those 4 positions in my mind, fairly quickly, and with high-quality candidates. So,
And I'm sure your staff is very happy.
yes, yes.
Yes, I just want to take a moment before you keep going and say welcome, Tina.
Okay, so my shameless plug for evaluation is due. Just want to remind you to submit your comments regarding my evaluation to Mr. Brown by January 5th. Consistent with some of the conversation we had at Executive Nominating Committee, we are currently recruiting 2 new trustees. They are Ohio Moss appointees in the type of family member category. And we already have 1 quality application in the door and 1 additional pending. We've not quite received that one yet, but I do expect it to come. Nonetheless, we will continue to do our recruitment process to see what else develops. But we are very excited with the 2 candidates that have presented themselves so far. They're very high-quality individuals. The typical process, I'll just remind you all, we identify somebody, they express interest, shoot those names to me. I will reach out to them and provide them some particulars about what are the minimum eligibility requirements, if you remember all your, the way you guys went through stuff. Then we send an application, they bring the application back, I forward that over to Senna, or the chair vets it, and most of the time establishes a meeting time where we go and just have a conversation with them. From there, Senna will make a recommendation to, if it's a stated recommendation, she instructs me to sign the form and we ship it up to the Ohio Moss. Ohio Moss is then on their own timeline, but they typically will review it and then contact the applicant, do a mini interview by phone, and then make a decision from there. They usually contact us too, just to make sure we're still all on the same. If it's the county, county usually collects their applications directly, and then they'll send them over to us. They'll ask us to vet them for any conflict of interest, and then they'll also ask us for recommendations. But both appointing authorities are not under no obligation to to accept our recommendations. They can basically do whatever they want. But here we are 12 years later, anniversary yesterday, by the way. And to date, they've only denied one recommendation. So we're doing pretty well as a board, making those recommendations, and the process seems to be working very efficiently and effectively. So, but if you come across anybody that meet that family category, either on substance use or mental health, or if they meet a different category, because we are pretty solid on all those categories, mental health and substance use family. If they meet if they're a clinician, or if they're an individual in recovery or received treatment services in the past, those folks, I'm sure we can figure out a way to work with Ohio Moss to consider them as well. Okay, so we're going to try something a little differently this year. If you remember in years past, for those of you that have been through the purchasing plan process, this is about the time we usually start those discussions. And in the end, we normally ask you to approve the purchasing plan timeline. And then invariably, we miss a couple of purchasing plan deadlines and have to come back to you to request a revision of the purchasing plan timeline because it has been approved. Well, it seems like we're just kind of creating some work for ourselves that may be unnecessary. So with if there isn't any objection, board staff are planning to simply today present you the timeline, but not ask for your approval, so that we have some flexibility for the timeline. So I want to cover in somewhat detail what that means. Now, let's start with, you will be asked at the end of this to allocate somewhere around $28 million to the community and another 3 or 3.5 to 4 to board-specific projects and administration. So in essence, $32 million. I don't think it's an understatement to say this is one of the most important things that you will do in your capacity as trustees. So if there are things that we can provide you to make that decision easier that you currently aren't getting or don't see, then let's have that conversation and we will see what we can get for you. But as you can imagine, it is a laborious process. It will start next month, and it will run all the way through May, as the timeline currently suggests, with an opportunity to bleed into June if we have to. So let me just kind of cover some of the highlights. So on January 3rd at our Planning and Oversight Committee meeting, and by the way, I have all this written down, so you don't, I can send this out to you in a written format, so it'll be, because it's 3 pages. So, at the Planning and Oversight Committee meeting in January, our, as I've stated previously, the main thing related to the purchasing plan is we will be providing you a first look at the draft provider agreement for fiscal year 24. At the same time, it will be going out to the providers for their feedback. So from there, we'll take your feedback, the provider's feedback, work through legal, and then board staff will come back to you and present that final draft, and it'll be later in the timeline, and I'll make sure I reference that. The board meeting on the 17th will be the presentation of the strategic plan. Rama will be here virtually to present the strategic plan, and it'll be you'll be requested to approve that at that point in time. So you will not hear that strategic plan on September 3rd, or I'm sorry, January 3rd. I want you to note that this strategic plan and the purchasing plan process needs to be a little flexible, so it might not always go through a committee structure. We will do our best to make sure that happens, but in this instance, it will not. Because the ITP Phase 2 is such a big element of our strategic plan, Ascend will be in on that day as well, and will present their recommendations from their Phase 1 work and recommendations for Phase 2. So the January 17th meeting has an opportunity to be a little bit longer than maybe some of our other meetings, but we'll try and keep it we'll try and keep it an efficient use of your time. At that point, at that meeting, we are also going to try to get some additional organizational performance, agency performance data for you, a retroactive look, but that'll really be as reference material for what we hope will be the calendar year report that you'll get later in the timeline. February 17th, you'll see the final provider agreement recommendations. You will receive a February 7th, planning and oversight, sorry. I said wrong date. We'll present the financial forecast, an updated financial forecast, because you need to know where we're at and what we have in order to think about what we're going to try and spend. We'll give you a fiscal year 23 summary of programs, so the description of the programs, basically one paragraph of what is currently being, purchased, so that you have an idea, and I know you do, but just as a reminder, these are the things that these programs, do, as reference. You will also see a fairly important document that has taken on a tremendous amount of board time and energy called the community plan. You've seen the community plan before. You usually see it annually, but you have not seen it like this. Ohio Mas has entirely revamped the entire plan. I can't even tell you how many hours, man hours, people hours, we have invested in this community plan, learning the way Ohio Mas wants this new structure. And that plan will give you a very strong overview of what we currently do, what we're proposing to do as it relates to the strategic plan, what are our priorities that have been established. It even has an inventory of services on it. It has a whole bunch of different things, and it is literally hundreds of pages, so we will probably not give it to you in a paper format, but post it electronically. That has to be approved in February because that is due to Ohio Mas. We actually have a month extension because it was due at the end of January, but we're not going to have it done. And then another important part of the February meeting is you will have your first look at board staff recommendation for 120-day notices. All 120-day notices have to be approved by March 1st, so that to meet Ohio Revised Code requirements. The typical process is board staff will evaluate the programs, current operations, current spending, current outcomes, look retrospectively, which is why we'll be giving you retrospective stuff as well. And then we will make recommendations. You, as a group, will be free to obviously consider any of those recommendations, deny those recommendations, add recommendations. It is your decision on how all that works out. But all of that will be completed by and approved for the February 21st meeting, which is the board meeting where the 120-day notices will be approved to give us time to communicate to the providers in writing the substantial changes or whatever changes we're proposing. On the 21st, we will also have TBD, our crisis care consultant, come in and do another primer on outcomes-based purchasing and where we're at on that. If you recall, we did one in September. We told you we'd be back. Timing didn't line up to get it before this meeting, so we're going to push them to February so that we're in that same process, thought process, because that will affect at least the ZEF contract for crisis services. So I want you to be able to understand that. We will also approve the draft provider agreement on that date for a final, and approve the community plan on that date for final. So there is a lot of work going on. The next day, staff will immediately mail the 120-day notices out. Of course, we work with our legal on the notices and how to structure those notices. I think it's important to note that because we're essentially revising substantially our provider agreement. All agencies are going to get a 120-day notice specifically related to the changes in the contract. And then whatever changes related to programming, funding, outcomes, et cetera, will be in addition to that 120-day notice. So, also at that time, we've already sent out, and this, you guys don't see this, but we send out like applications to our current existing provider network or tell us what you want to do for next year. Here's, then we have a discussion about what their changes are to their programs, what the outcome changes might be. Internally, we're talking about will you get the 2% increase or not, based on findings, and all that stuff is happening behind the scenes. And then we'll be meeting with agencies as needed. Once they get the 120-day notice, we will ask them to provide us a timeline or a notice for if they plan on appealing our decision of the 120-day notice. By revised code, there is an appeal process established within the 120-day notice process. The first 6 months, or the first 60 days, is a local appeal process where if they disagree with your decision regarding the changes or the contract language or et cetera, they will provide that to us in writing, the reason that they disagree. They'll meet with the board staff, and we will try and work out something. If we are unable to work something out, then they have the ability to request a face-to-face meeting with you all. So their board and your board. Depending on the number of those, we may have to stage them in at all the remaining meetings until April 30th. So you might be seeing one group at a planning and oversight committee, you might see another one at a board meeting, and so forth, until we move them, until we get them all in front of you. Each time, board staff will document and work towards reconciliation of any appeal discussions. In the end, it is ultimately your decision on if you accept or deny, want to amend, whatever you want to do on that. But those decisions will be done by the end of April. Because if the agency or we disagree with, we as a board, that is, disagree with where this is heading, we can actually ask for a non-binding mediation from the state. And they can then decide if they want to be involved or not. And the agencies have the same ability to do that. So we have to make room for that 60 days before July 1. I wanted to make sure I explained that 120-day process because it is a lengthy discussion. March 7th, we're at the Planning and Oversight Committee meeting. We present your agency performance reports for calendar year 22 to add to the body of knowledge regarding additional, why we were doing 120-day notices. Ideally, we would have that information to you before March 1st, but folks, the reality is we can't do that. We don't get it until mid-January. We can't create that report and get it to you within a week and a half. So we will have that information internally, so we'll be able to use it internally, and we will get it to you. And obviously, if we're using it as part of our justification, it will be in the write-up for what we decide. For whatever we decide to recommend. We will also, at that March 7th meeting, you'll see the first round of agency appeals. So you'll start to see recommendations from staff on how to resolve certain appeals. And obviously, we work closely with the agencies at that point so that we represent their interests and our interests. But at some point, there may be a disconnect where the agency wants a certain thing and we're not willing to go that direction. That is when they can say, hey, I want to meet with your board. So we may be ready to have a couple of those presentations, hearings, if you want to call them that, at that March 7th meeting. We'll certainly have it at the March 21st meeting, which is the full board meeting. And we will continuously update the 120-day appeal process at that meeting as well. So we just keep working it, just so you're aware. It's a very fluid process. April 4th, again, more recommendations, potential hearing. But it's also the first time you see a full consideration of preliminary recommendations for fiscal year 24 programs and services. So if you remember that Excel spreadsheet that you get, it'll list all 85 programs by name, by agency, last year's amount, this year's amount, or recommended amount, and then maybe have a few notes in the site. So that's us coming to you and saying, hey, here's our recommendations. Again, you're free to look at that and say, no, let's tweak this, let's do that, let's do that. And some of that happens within the 120-day process in some cases, but not always. The vast majority of the agencies will go, we're good, but that's not always the case, depending on the circumstance. April 18th, which is a board meeting, we'll finalize any agency appeals, we'll finalize any provider agreement changes that result out of the 120-day appeal process, because we're approving it with the intent that this is what we're going to send to the agencies, but they're going to come back and likely do and say, hey, no, we want these changes, and then we try and work it out, and if we can't, we'll present it to you as that, and then you make a decision on, do you want to change it or not? That brings us to May. The May will present the final recommendations for all programs that were given a 120-day notice, so we're saying, okay, these are all settled, here it is. We will also present the board administrative budget at that point in time. That's the May 2nd May 2nd meeting, and we usually call that the combined planning and oversight and executive nominating, because the executive nominating is responsible for the board administrative budget. But you're all here anyway, so so it really
It would be the only reason why.
Potato, right?
Yeah, it would be the only reason why we would call that.
Yeah.
So.
Mind you, somewhere in this, we will squeeze in election of officers, because our officers term out at the end of this fiscal year. We'll figure out where to plug that in, but we do have a placeholder in June for that to occur. May 16th, board meeting, we approve the final recommendations, we approve the board administrative budget, and then we take June off. No, we take July off, but we use June as a buffer for anything that has to be pushed. And let's be real, guys, something almost always has to be pushed. So that's why we build in that month. So there is a tremendous amount of work between now and then, and again, I want to reiterate, this is probably one of the most important things you're going to do as a trustee. And I know you take it seriously, and we want to support you the best that we can so that you can make the best decisions for our community. I'm going to stop there and simply say Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, and Happy New Year. That is my report.
Questions? Yeah.
So the strategic plan is going to be presented and approved on January 17th. And by the way, I will send this out
Yeah, I want to get them.
tomorrow morning. And it's all aligned on the board meetings and planning and oversight committee. So there isn't anything new that I'm adding into your calendars, all right? Just, we're keeping it. Now, we may end up getting in the, towards the end of April and go, oh, we might need a special meeting. But we will avoid that at all costs. Okay, thank you.
For the newer members that haven't been through this process, it sounds much more complicated than what it is, I promise you. But it's really, it is complicated in terms of reviewing all the documents prior to the meetings and that kind of thing. So we appreciate all the extra time that it's gonna take to study everything and whatnot, to make well-informed decisions.
And I know I said finally, but I'll say finally one more time. When we're over, I hope that everybody will stick around and enjoy some of the refreshments that we have available. And just maybe kibitz for a while as we celebrate the holidays.
Scott, will we have a meeting like we did at the board where people come and bring their presentations or talk?
So we already did the focus groups, so we will not be having, outside of the appeals process,
Okay.
those things that you would normally see in a February timeframe.
Okay.
We include that in the strategic planning process.
Thank you.
Good question. All right, open session. Richard, please.
As we speak, City Council is meeting, 48 items on the agenda. That's because they've been going first reading on so many of them. Some are controversial. According to their calendar, they have 2 more meetings this week. One is neighborhoods and one is finance. But given City Council, they do schedule at the last minute. But probably those will be the last meetings until the first week of January. I did want to voice my concern. We should be keeping an eye on what's going on in New York City. If no one is familiar with this, the mayor there has ordered his first responders to start picking up and hospitalizing mentally ill people, even if they are not involved in criminal activity. Civil rights activists have been speaking out. First responders are just delighted that, like, they're not doing enough as it is. They're going to have to voluntary, bringing people that are involuntary into hospitals. But what concerns me the most, his plan says we will keep them in an inpatient setting until housing has been located for them, housing which at this point does not exist. The housing advocates in New York have told the mayor, we don't have any more housing, we have long waiting lists as it is. But they will, under the mayor's plan, remain in an inpatient setting until some kind of a bed somewhere is located for them. And statistical data can be manipulated to say whatever you want it to say. I'm sure that if New York City officials can manipulate the data and say, as a result of this, we reduced homelessness X amount of percent, you'll see other cities consider it also. So the pendulum is definitely swinging away from outpatient voluntary towards inpatient involuntary. And we should keep an eye on this. Thank you.
So, thank you, Richard. I've actually been following a little bit of that, and I don't know exactly how the New York laws are created, but let's remind you of how Ohio works. All right, so Ohio doesn't work like that. Law enforcement has the ability to require an emergency evaluation only. That's it. Law enforcement does not hospitalize people. Only a doctor can admit somebody into a psychiatric unit, or a probate judge can order it. Those are the only 2 ways that you get in, other than saying, yes, I'd like to be in the hospital. So that replication in our units is unlikely, but I think your point regarding the change in philosophy is of greater note, in that Ohio law is changing, will change, to allow greater flexibility for law enforcement to request an emergency evaluation. And just remind you, emergency evaluation is just that. Law enforcement delivers them to one of our designated agencies or to a psychiatric hospital. Psychiatrist has to do an evaluation within 24 hours and determine within 72 hours if that individual should be held involuntarily. If they determine that person is to be held involuntarily, they cannot hold them. They have to petition the court through an affidavit process. And only the judge, probate court judge, can then require that individual to be held over the 72-hour period. The vast majority of people who are taken to a hospital on an emergency evaluation by law enforcement or by one of our health officers that you guys designate monthly turn voluntary. And I'm talking 95, 96, 98%, somewhere in that category. We are blessed with a lot of psychiatric hospital units here. And I believe that they continue to use them appropriately, although we do wish that we could get some more acute clients access to some longer-term levels of care than what we have in the private sector at this point.
So just, I want to be clear, so if an emergency personnel roll up on somebody having a mental crisis.
Police, not
not
EMS.
Okay, just police only. They can take them to an emergency department, they've got, or some type of a designated center, they've got 72 hours to evaluate them. Then if they evaluate, if somebody wants to be hospitalized, is that a choice?
If they meet the admission criteria that a doctor, so they have 24 hours to evaluate by a psychiatrist. So they'll take them usually to one of the two units, or to Zeph.
Okay.
They'll be evaluated, and then the hospital will determine if hospitalization is appropriate. At that point, they'll be asking them, would you like to stay? And if so, sign in. The value of signing in is you can sign yourself out with 24 hours notice. If you try to do that before the doctor thinks you're ready, then he can then petition the court or repaint. Well, I guess it wouldn't be repaint because that's already been relinquished, so they would just do another pink slip, so to speak.
I do want to say, Richard, thank you for updating us on all information that you give. I was in a meeting and someone said, as a board member, you need to be updated on council, on the county and the city and what's going on and all new policies. And I said, well, first of all, I have Richard, thank God. And secondly, I mean, the news and everything, but I just want to say thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you. Deep appreciation, absolutely, for articulating that so eloquently. Anything else for open session? Cookie time, meeting adjourned.
Thanks, everybody. Merry Christmas.